Hello everyone. In this video, you'll learn how to unlock the full potential of your Qidi printer. Your Qidi printer comes from the factory with Klipper that must be updated via USB. That alone makes it a little bit of a pain, but Qidi tends to provide releases and bug fixes for a certain period of time, and then they just seem to stop. However, meanwhile, Klipper continues to advance. The problem with upgrading or installing Klipper yourself from scratch, which is what I originally wanted to do, is this screen. This is not a standard HDMI screen, and it doesn't use Klipper screen. And so if you install a standard version of Klipper, it won't know how to communicate with this screen. This screen actually has its own CPU, its own memory, and its own software, and it communicates with the main board via a serial port. So something has to be done with the screen or you live without the screen. I really wanted the screen to work. So there's this software out there available as open source. It's called FreeDi. And this is software where a person here, Phil, took a substantial amount of time and built software for the screen to work with Klipper. And this project, at least currently, is for Qidi's X3 printers. And again, it's custom LCD firmware as well as the latest version of Klipper. There's an installation guide. He also has a video as well. I encourage you to go take a look. Just real quick, it takes a lot of time and effort as a former software developer myself. And if you can, please contribute. Again, it's an enormous amount of work to do something like this. So first thing, going to the GitHub site and taking a look at the installation guide. The documentation on GitHub has two paths you can take. Way B, which is if you have a complete stock system or want to start from scratch or fresh. And then there's way A if you've already installed the clean version of Klipper and the operating system previously. However, even if you have, I recommend you just go ahead and do way B. It'll work in either case, and it'll probably take care of any issues that may come up based on any installations you might have done before. As far as the requirements, you're going to need an eMMC flash device. This printer has eMMC flash. It doesn't use SD cards in terms of where the operating system runs off of. There's this first version and then the second version, which is option B. This is the version I actually ended up purchasing. It's not very expensive, probably about 10 bucks. You can try to use the USB drive, but it doesn't look like that option was tested very well. You will also need a wired Ethernet connection to this printer. There'll be a period of time where Wi-Fi may not be operable and you'll need to SSH into this printer. You need wired Ethernet. And I did not use an SD card. If you have some familiarity with SSH, of course, I'm going to show you how that works here, but it would be ideal if you did. You also need to use a Balena Etcher, an image writing tool, and if you have one, it would probably be nice to have an FTP client as well. There's some cases where that's useful. You need to know your printer's IP address. You can get that from the printer as it runs today, or take a look in your router. And you'll also need use of the login credentials, which in this case is here's your user and password, which is standard and what can be used to get into the machine. So getting back to the eMMC storage, by default, this machine has 8 gigs of storage, which really isn't that much. For normal operation, it does work. However, for $5, and it's here listed as optional, you can go for a 32 gig eMMC storage device, and you can actually buy it as a package included with the USB adapter above. And what's nice about that is you actually don't really, well, you can use everything that's on 8 gig as a complete and total backup. So if you ever need to revert to the original machine, you can just pop it back in. In the meantime, you get 32 gigs of storage, which is much more storage, and that's what we'll use for our image, and that's what I'm going to do in this video. Taking a look at this up close, the USB connection, there's an SD card slot as well, and here's the pin connector for the eMMC storage. In addition, this is the 32 gigabyte eMMC storage. It looks exactly like the 8 gig one. Don't get them mixed up, and it will plug in that way. Now, this is a bare circuit board, and so I recommend that you 3D print a case for this. I've got a link to the STL in the description. It's really simple, no glue, it snaps together. This simply pops right in, and then you've got the lid that goes on top as well. But again, this just snaps in. There's a little hole there so you can see the LED on the circuit board. And as you can see, everything is accessible easily. And here the eMMC plugs right in, ready for us, or ready to be written to. So first we need to back up our important files. And here I'm going to the Fluid site, which is this web interface on my Qidi printer. You should know your IP address. If not, look it up on the printer or on the router. And the port is 10,088. So when you take a look at the configuration files, anything with a BAK or a BKP isn't really needed because those are backups. You can certainly back them up if you want to, but anything with a CFG or that ends in an INI, or in this case an MKS EMMC, these are things that are probably important to keep. In fact, they're not probably, they are. So here I'm right-clicking and I select download, and of course I can select where I'm going to save this to, and do this for every single one of these files. Now your web browser may actually flag these files that you download as, if I'm here, I'm looking at my download history, as an insecure download. And so make sure you click keep, because if not, you'll get a file that you really can't do anything with. But if you hit keep, when you go take a look at where you've saved this, you will find you have a completely readable file. And I highly recommend you check as well. Here you can see I've gone to my computer's file manager where I did the backups, and I'm opening up the files each one by one, just trying to make sure I have a copy of these files. So going back to the FreeDi GitHub site, back to the section on backups, everything I did you can pretty much see here. The instructions do a really good job of outlining what you need to do, whether you're using Fluid or Mainsail. It also mentions a full image backup. If you're not replacing your eMMC storage with a new one or a larger one, you should do this backup. I did not. I simply unscrewed this eMMC from the controller from the MCU, and that's my backup. But again, it's never hurt. It's certainly safe to go ahead and back it up anyway. And so here's the guide for how this gets installed, and it discusses how to flash the operating system image. I highly recommend you take a look at all of this. Also within the image, it shows you what's included, which is quite a bit. And again, I strongly recommend you read all of this. It briefly covers the actual image itself. And here, if you go to the images section, here you can see the absolute latest version. This is actually the version I installed. By the time you read this video, there may be a newer version. Be sure you take a look at the updates. And here it explains why you don't need to use an SD card, because with this version and above, it's fully automated and essentially it flashes for you. Again, take a look at this really quick. Scrolling down here, it shows you all the new updates. It discusses new macros and fixes. Here it shows for the X Smart 3. some of the changes, which is the printer I have. But here you can see the three images for the X Max 3, the X Plus 3, and the X Smart 3. You need to download the version that matches your printer model. And once you do that, we can move on to the next step. So here I'm using Etcher. I've already selected the image file, and here I'm selecting the eMMC that is plugged in via USB using the MKS reader-writer. And in my case, on my PC, and probably if you're using a Mac, you'll have to authenticate to get the rights to write to this device. And then you just sit here and wait a little while this thing flashes and then verifies. I've speeded up this video by about 10 times, and so when you do this yourself and it runs much slower, please don't be surprised. Once the flashing operation is complete, eject it from your PC using the eject command in the operating system, and then remove the eMMC chip from the reader-writer. And then flip your printer over and unscrew the plate. This really depends on which Qidi printer you have. In my case, it's an X Smart 3, and so the controller is in the bottom, and you've got a bunch of screws here to undo. And I'm speeding this up as well because no one wants to see this. So up at the top here, right next to the green CPU cooler, you can see the eMMC storage device. There's simply two screws here that need to be removed, and it's fairly easy. Undo the two screws, plug the new one in, the replacement. So here I've already plugged in the new one, and I'm simply going to bolt this in. Now in this particular model, which is the X Smart 3, you can see here there is an Ethernet connector, but because of where the board is mounted, there's a piece of plastic here, and you can't insert the Ethernet cable. And so I ended up unscrewing these four screws so I can lift it away, and then I can plug in the Ethernet cable, which again will help me finish the process. I don't know how the other models are, but on the X Smart 3, unless you've got a very special Ethernet cable, you're going to need to do this. It's easy. So here it's actually unscrewed. The MCU is unscrewed, and I'm able to insert that. Also, here's a Wi-Fi dongle. Qidi apparently shipped these with different modules at different times, and so they're not all consistent. And so I highly recommend you pull it out and take a look and see which one you've got. I've got this Tenda model, which was a very early version, and which sometimes causes some issues, and we'll get that in a minute. But just make sure you know what it is. And just as importantly, make sure you plug it back in, because we do want this to work. We'll need it later. We don't want to run this off of Ethernet because there's really no holes on this printer to support a cable. So once you've done that, turn on power to the printer. And once you do, if you take a look at the screen, you will see the MCU and the toolhead board update. And once that's done, you should get this Klipper screen. You can hit restart and your printer will restart. You may have to power cycle it. So once that's complete and your 3D printer has restarted, now it's time to go in and make changes to the new CFG files. And here, if you take a look at the instructions, you should see at least most of the machine running, but you should also be getting a Klipper error. And that's because, at least right now, there's some settings that have to change. And you can go in one by one and make these changes, but you need to go to this post install and config section. And again, these are all new CFG files, so you're going to be modifying them a little bit. And the way you do is you actually compare these to your pre-existing files. But again, it goes through step by step here. So here I'm going in, and I will open up the printer.cfg file. And the goal here now is to compare settings to settings that I have in the file I backed up. So you'll have your old file opened up in a text editor somewhere, and then you can start to scroll through these. And some of the areas that are important, you want to take a look at the fan section. Make sure the pins match because there were some differences on some of the boards. And then you also want to go in and check to make sure the amperage on the motors, for example, on the extruder, as well as the AB motors or XY motors and the Z motor as well. And make sure when you take a look at the extruder section, that matches. I don't think there were any changes in gear ratios or anything like that, but you should just go ahead and check anyway. Um, I did have to make some changes on bed mesh. I found the default settings didn't take into account at least where the induction probe was placed on my XSmart 3, and it would home improperly in Z. Make sure these look all right, and then you can hit save and exit, and you want to restart Klipper. And you'll probably see a new set of error messages, and you'll have to go through these one by one until you get through them. It'll happen quickly, it won't take very long. Here, checking the amperage of the motors and to make sure they match what was backed up in my previous printer.cfg file. I had a slight problem when homing the printer. Um, I'm sure what's here works for probably the other XSmart series of printers, but I had a problem where the induction probe was trying to measure off the edge of the bed. And so here you can see where I copied but commented out the original line. And then for Y, I went in and just took the copy of that line and uh, divided it by 2. Which I will fine tune later, but at least it got the induction probe back onto the bed and then I could home properly. And you might want to give these other macros just a quick once over as well. And again, whenever you're done changing these, hit save and restart Klipper. After doing this 3 or 4 times, when you go back to your dashboard, you should see no error messages. And at that point, be careful, but you can start testing your printer. So once that's running, unplug your Ethernet cable and try to connect to your printer via Wi-Fi. If you can't, you probably have that Tenda Wi-Fi module that I did. And if you go back to the site, to the GitHub site, there's this little script that you can install that you can run to fix the Wi-Fi. And so simply copy this and really just follow the directions. So here I'm copying the text and I've SSH'd, pasting this. There's some oddities going on with my video here. I apologize for that. But answer the questions. You'll be using the stock mainboard. Use the standard MKS default login and password. And you need to go kind of quickly because as you notice, this bypassed me, and which means it won't have the login to properly communicate, and it will eventually get an error and the Wi-Fi won't actually work. So if you do what I did and take too long, you'll have to rerun this installer again and again answer the questions properly, and including the login and password, which is the MKS login and password. And once you do, you should be okay. This takes a little bit longer than you'd expect, but it'll get done soon enough. And then restart the printer. All right, we're almost done. So if you used a 32 gigabyte eMMC like I did, there's a tiny issue here, and it is the image we wrote to it was designed for an 8 gig eMMC. This isn't really a big problem other than if you don't make this change, you're not going to be able to use more than 8 gigs of your 32 gigs. So I have trouble following directions, but based on my Linux background, um, I used option 2. There are 4 options on how to grow the partition, but I used fdisk. I'm not going to show you that. It's maybe a little more complicated, a little harder to use. But if you take a look at number 1, is all you need to do is SSH into the system, copy and paste this and execute that, and then reboot, and you should have all 32 gigs available. And you really must do this to make use of the space. And the only other thing I can offer at this point is if you take a look at the right-hand side of this page, there's first steps where it goes through bed leveling, calibrating the Z offset, um, uh, resetting the input shaping, do the tuning of the nozzle and the bed temperatures. And, if you didn't do it before, make sure you do those now. And once you do, your printer should be working better than ever. If you found this video useful and informative, please click subscribe. And in addition, I highly recommend, if possible, you thank the creators of this software. It's really a massive improvement for your Qidi printer. And, if you can throw a little something, a little donation their way, you'll find the link on their GitHub. Again, I recommend you do. It takes a lot of time and effort to put these together, and you will be impressed, especially with the screens. So thank you.